There's few logos in gaming that are more recognizable than Quake, and clearly I'm not the only one who thinks this, as virtually every mainline title in the Quake franchise has featured the exact same logo. But while the logo has stayed largely intact, the overall games have taken quite different approaches to the overall setting and gameplay loop. The original Quake is often described as a Lovecraftian horror-inspired shooter, featuring things like ogres and demonic beasts. Quake 2 became a bit more of a sci-fi shooter, with the main narrative following a conflict involving humanity and an alien race called the Strogg, who were essentially half human and half cyborg. Quake 3 then pivoted to a multiplayer-focused shooter, which, while it did have a single-player mode, didn't have a campaign per se. Quake 4 returned to the campaign roots with effectively a continuation of the Quake 2 story, and then Quake Champions went back to the Quake 3 multiplayer setting. This isn't even touching on the official and unofficial expansions, of which there are plenty. The point is that Quake has been through a lot of evolutions from where it first started. However, of all the paid games, that is excluding Quake Champions, the original Quake, at least on PC, still holds the highest Metacritic rating. Now, I specify PC because while it is available for virtually every platform today, thanks to the impressive Night Dive Studios remaster, which I'll get to shortly, when it initially released in the 90s, it was available for both home computers and consoles, with the PC version being the superior version by all accounts. I mentioned before that there was a Night Dive Studios remaster, and that is the version we're going to be playing today. Now, I do own the original Windows version of Quake, however, after spending some time with the remaster, I feel that it represents the original title very faithfully while adding significant quality of life improvement, especially around video and control. Now, you do have a choice in this remaster of turning on a lot of additional graphical flourishes, which, while a novel, in my opinion, do change the overall original ambience of the game, so I've opted to disable these, but the option certainly exists if you want more of a modern-looking experience. Story is typical for 1996, that is, you will learn more about the story from reading the game manual as opposed to the game itself. So, in the far future, humanity has invented teleportation technology, which they have dubbed slipgates. Unfortunately for humanity, an extra-dimensional enemy, codenamed Quake, has managed to tap into these slipgates and started sending through death squads through these gates to humanity's dimension. The player's brief is simple. Starting at an overrun human base, enter Quake's extra-dimensional locations via slipgate and fight your way through the environment until you're able to locate a magic rune. There are some text dumps at the end of each episode to fill the player in of the progress of the story, but it isn't a particularly deep story. Once you have collected all of these magic runes, you're able to face down the Quake boss. Now, look, it's not exactly Shakespeare here, but it's more than a serviceable story and is supported in-game by some great environmental storytelling, which does a great job of selling the idea of these multiple dimensions. Unlike other games of the time, like Unreal and Half-Life, Quake rarely has any downtime between the moment-to-moment combat and puzzle solving, so while there's not too much storytelling in the game, because of the relatively fast-paced gameplay, it doesn't really feel like it's missing. Before we continue, a massive thank you to those who support the channel. If you enjoy this type of content, please consider liking the video or subscribing to the channel. With that out of the way, let's suit up, grab a rocket launcher, and head back to 1996 to remember Quake. Coming from the same people who brought us Doom, expectations for Quake were always going to be sky high. So does it meet these expectations? Yes, it does. Quake was one of the first real-time 3D rendered video games, which gave the developers a lot more freedom to bring new ideas to life, as well as reimagine ideas that worked from past titles into a more modern implementation. One of the largest changes that Quake evolved from the Doom formula was a much greater emphasis on verticality in levels. While Doom had great levels, the majority of them were largely flat. This worked fine though because you didn't have the ability to jump. Quake, on the other hand, features extensive verticality and uses a jump mechanic in both puzzles and combat. Now, combat itself also has had a lot of changes compared to something like Doom. While I'm certainly not criticizing it, Doom had a fairly simple combat system. You see enemies, they move towards you shooting projectiles or move towards you to do melee damage, and you need to respond with the appropriate level of force to eliminate them. There was enemy variety, but apart from a larger health or damage pool, they were largely the same horse with a different rider. Quake's combat system is far more dynamic. You have vastly different enemies which require vastly different strategies to defeat. Take the Ogre for example, which has both a grenade launcher for use at range and a chainsaw for melee. It doesn't sound like much of a difference, but when you factor in the grenades, especially on harder difficulties, you need to become a lot more mobile in your combat, potentially encountering other enemies who themselves are also quite mobile, such as the Knight. Then there's enemies like the zombies, who unless destroyed with explosives, will simply be knocked down and get up again shortly after, something that in some of the more close quarters areas of the game can be quite a challenge. All of these enemies and mechanics contribute to create a far more unpredictable and therefore challenging combat loop. Now, as far as the actual challenge goes, you start the game in somewhat of a hub world, which requires you to first select your difficulty level by walking through an appropriately labelled slipgate. Once you've selected the difficulty, you're presented with another hub world, which effectively lets you choose from the game's 4 episodes before taking on the final game boss. While none of your weapons carry over between the episodes, this isn't really a problem, as except for the most powerful weapon in the game, a literal lightning rod called the Thunderbolt, all of the weapons are generally found within the first 2 to 3 chapters of each episode. One of the good things about the weapons, and a testament to the overall pacing of the game, which is excellent, is that when you find a new weapon, such as a grenade launcher, it will often immediately present you with a somewhat safe area to test it out before increasing the odds against you. This stands out most in the case of the grenade and rocket launcher, but it's generally true for all of the weapons. There's also generally plentiful ammo within all of the levels, which keeps the pace of the game up. And while the ammo types do vary, this is actually a good thing, as it encourages the player to use all of the weapons available to them as opposed to just sticking to 1 or 2, which I have certainly been guilty of in other shooters. Now, when you're not engaged in combat, you will be exploring Quake's levels with the ultimate goal of finding the next slipgate at the end of the level. The actual levels themselves vary in design. There are levels that can be breezed through quite quickly and other levels which take longer, generally because they contain puzzles. These puzzles range from simple platforming to activating switches and collecting keys to open doors, to more complex things like finding passages which are not always obvious to the player. Well, at least they weren't obvious to me. Although I will say for the most part, Quake does a good job of signposting where you need to go next, as well as highlighting when things in a level may have changed thanks to an in-game notification. And look, you can tell the developers knew that players would have the most fun when they were progressing at a relatively consistent pace, and that's really evident with a lot of these design decisions. If you do explore a little though, you will often find secret areas which often contain items like Mega Health and my favourite, Quad Damage, which you're never going to guess multiplies your damage by 4, enabling you to tear through just about any group of enemies during its 30-second duration. There are several sections which include water in the game, and despite there not being a crouch function or dedicated submerge button as I guess it would be in other games, swimming and water traversal maintains the same fast pace as the drier sections of the game. And I can't believe I'm about to say this, but even the few water-based puzzles in the game are quite good and never once descended into frustration. There is water-based combat also, both in the shallows and underwater, although thanks to the rocket launcher's ability to shoot underwater, I often ended up creeping around like some type of U-boat, taking care of above-ground enemies before they could even get a shot on me. Oh, and of course I had to perform the realism test of if using an electric weapon underwater will electrocute you. Yes, it will. One of the more interesting areas of the game, which honestly I'd forgotten about until I played through it again for this video, was the wind tunnel level. Essentially, you're in an environment where you progress through the level by activating various wind tunnels which suck you up and shoot you off to a new area. Now, I'm not going to say this was the world's most advanced implementation of physics, but you need to understand that things like this just didn't exist in 1996, and it really stands out as both an interesting environment for the player and a way for the developers to show off their new 3D engine. Now, normally at this point in the video, I critique things that I didn't like about the game. However, both thinking back and looking back through my notes, I really didn't find anything that stood out enough for me to actually record it. Now, no game is 100% perfect, but in the case of Quake, it is an extremely polished first-person shooter, which stands as strong as it did in 1996 over 25 years later. Look, if I change the framing of this section from critiques to areas I think could have been further improved, there are a few things that come to mind, but I want to stress I'm looking really hard to come up with these. Firstly, for me, the weapons are the weakest part of the experience, and this comes from the fact that there is quite a lot of duplication. What I mean by that is that once you get the super shotgun, you have no reason to ever use the regular shotgun. Once you get the super nail gun, you have no reason to ever use the standard nail gun. It's not exactly the case with the grenade and rocket launcher, but you'll certainly use the rocket launcher a lot more. This issue really stems from the fact that not only do all of these weapon pairs use the exact same ammo type, but apart from episode 1, all of the weapons are found relatively quickly after one another. I feel like there needed to be more reward for effort for engaging in close combat, but using the axe is pretty much a one-way ticket to the game over screen. The other area I think could have been improved are the power-ups. Quad damage is a lot of fun to use, but it's only ever really found as a secret, and with its duration of 30 seconds, you don't really get to have a lot of fun with it. I feel like there could have been some areas where the quad damage was gifted to the player and then allowed them to enter an area to use it to its full advantage. As I said though, these are minor things, and none of them ever actively detracted from the overall experience. It doesn't matter if you're looking at the original release or the Night Dive Studios remastering. Quake has very high presentation values, which have almost appreciated as opposed to aged with time. From a graphical perspective, all of the environments, despite being unique, all feel cohesive, as if they all belong together, which when you consider some of the environmental variety is quite impressive. The game uses darkness in some levels to help sell the horror aesthetic, but it's never overused or to the stage where it's actually difficult to see what you need to do or where you need to go. Performance on modern platforms is obviously a moot point. However, upon initial release, the game did scale very well, meaning as long as you had a relatively modern PC, you could run Quake. Oh, and if you didn't own a copy of Windows in 1996, that wasn't a problem, as alongside the Windows release was a DOS release, which honestly is probably one of the last AAA DOS games ever released. Now, the Windows version was the version I played, and while I can't find a definitive list of differences between these launch versions, most sources seem to suggest that there were some minor control, sound, and video differences. Sound design, like presentation, is of an equally high standard, featuring an ambient soundtrack created by rock band Nine Inch Nails. It's certainly not quite what you'd expect from a rock band, but their passion and skill in music creation definitely shines through. It's certainly a different vibe than some of the more uplifting beats from games like Doom or even Duke Nukem 3D, but given the horror vibes of the game, it works surprisingly well. There's no voice acting, but effects are handled well, with everything from robust demon sounds to the clinking of grenades as they bounce around the floor. Perhaps my only criticism is that both of the shotguns sound a little underpowered, like they are missing some bass or something in the sound. I don't know, take a listen and let me know what you think. Overall though, sound is very solid and helps to cap off the overall presentation very well. While the first-person shooting market really took off in the late 90s, Quake stayed relevant far longer than it had any right to. While the graphics were revolutionary for 1996, it didn't take too long for these graphics to be substantially improved upon with games like Unreal. But I'd argue that Quake is a lot more fun and has therefore aged a lot more gracefully than Unreal. I'm not saying Unreal is a bad game, but where Unreal set a lofty benchmark of game environments, Quake set a lofty benchmark for game experience. Now, if I had to rank all of the Quake games today, from best to worst, I'd probably rank them in the order they were released, with the original Quake taking the best spot. While all of the sequels tried to improve upon the original, none of them really captured that horror-based theme, which I think made the original very unique. In modern times, we don't get a lot of horror-based first-person shooters, apart from perhaps the Resident Evil series. Maybe that's because of a lack of demand, or maybe it's from developers just not wanting to take the risk. Either way, as long as Night Dive Studios is around to remake some of these earlier classics, I'll be happy. But that's enough from me. Do you agree or disagree with my opinions? Let me know down in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching.